How could a prince of England, the son of a king, live and die almost as if he had never existed? What story hides behind that empty space? Why would a dynasty that prided itself on duty, legacy, and family unity conceal its own child? The answer begins on a bitterly cold night in January 1919 at Sandringham Estate, the royal retreat in Norfolk. Frost covered the fields and silence weighed heavily over the great house. Inside, candlelight quivered against stone walls and long corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens. Then, cutting through the stillness, a voice cried out from a small upstairs room. "The boy is gone." That boy was Prince John, the sixth and youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary. Yet in London, in the heart of the empire he was born to serve, many had never even heard his name. He was missing not only from the public eye, but from the very image of the royal family itself. In the official photograph of 1914 taken during the grim days of the First World War, the royal children sit in perfect formation, symbols of continuity and hope, but one is absent. The youngest is nowhere to be seen, as though history had chosen to erase him. This absence was not an accident. It was deliberate, a silence woven into every portrait, every ceremony, every article in the press. While his brothers and sisters carried the weight of future crowns and titles, John was quietly pushed from sight, hidden within the walls of Sandringham, his existence known to only a few. His is not a story of power or triumph, but of shadows and silence, of a child born into royalty yet denied even recognition. This is the dark fate of Prince John, the child the crown tried to hide. Stay with us until the very end of this story, and subscribe now, as we uncover the forgotten tragedies that royalty fought to keep buried. The summer of 1905 arrived with sunlight spilling over Norfolk fields, and at York Cottage, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, a cry broke through the walls. Princess Mary of Teck had delivered her sixth child, a son named John Charles Francis. Within the family, he would simply be called Johnny. Britain received the news with quiet celebration. The empire was vast, the monarchy secure, and another prince was always a reassurance. He was not born a boy. He was born a promise that the dynasty would continue unbroken, that crowns and titles would pass safely into future hands. At York Cottage, life seemed almost ordinary by royal standards. The house lacked the grandeur of Windsor or Buckingham, but its simplicity gave the family a domestic rhythm. Queen Mary, meticulous and disciplined, oversaw every detail of her children's upbringing. Toys were numbered, books catalogued, lessons timed to the minute. Even play carried the weight of order. John entered this world as the final piece of a carefully arranged tableau. His elder brothers were already set on paths of service and succession. Edward, the heir, stood as the hope of the throne. George, the second son, was destined for the Navy. Daughters were prepared for strategic marriages. John's role, though undefined, was still a symbol. The youngest branch of the royal tree, proof of plenty in the House of Windsor. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, shadows flickered. Photographs from those years show John in his mother's arms, plump-cheeked and bright-eyed, but slower, less focused than his siblings. He struggled to keep pace with their steps. His speech lagged. His energy often spilled beyond control, laughter erupting at the wrong moments, gestures too wild for the stiff world of etiquette. At dinners, he sometimes dropped his spoon, clapping at the sound as if it were a game. Small incidents, harmless to most. But in the palace, such details carried weight. One governess recorded in her notes that he seemed delightful, but difficult, too easily lost in his own little world. Doctors were summoned quietly, their reports filled with cautious terms, delayed development, clumsy movements, words that unsettled a family where every child was expected to stand as a model of duty. Queen Mary, who ruled her household with iron precision, could not ignore what she saw. Watching her son stumble across the nursery one evening, she let slip a rare murmur. "He does not walk as a prince should." It was the kind of observation that lingered. For in a dynasty where children were not only loved, but displayed as symbols of empire, John's quirks began to feel less like endearing traits and more like cracks in the facade. The boy born as a promise was already testing the limits of what promise meant. Still, there were moments of tenderness. In the gardens of York Cottage, John would chase butterflies until the knees of his trousers were stained green. He would press his cheek against the fur of the family's dogs, giggling in bursts of joy that made his nurse smile. In those private moments, he was only a child, untouched by the burden of crowns. Yet even these joys carried a quiet tragedy. His world of innocence was shrinking, as whispers began to grow louder behind closed doors. By 1908, as his brothers and sisters moved into carefully staged public roles, John was already beginning to vanish from the stage. The promise of his birth was intact only in words. In reality, doubts surrounded him, circling quietly like storm clouds over the empire. And soon, those clouds would break. The first unmistakable signs of difference were about to reveal themselves, and the promise that greeted his birth would fracture beyond repair. The first years of John's life passed quietly, yet by the time he reached 4, the shadows could no longer be ignored. What had once been dismissed as childish clumsiness became more troubling. He stumbled often, tripped on flat ground, his body uncoordinated. There were moments when his hands trembled as he tried to lift a toy, or when his speech faltered, words slipping away before they were fully formed. Doctors were summoned more frequently now, their notebooks filled with careful observations. One physician wrote that the boy's fits are frequent. His mind seems clouded. These were not words meant for public knowledge, but they echoed in the corridors of York Cottage, carried in whispers that grew heavier with each passing year. The seizures came suddenly, without warning. At breakfast, a spoon slipping from his hand. His body stiffening, nurses rushed to catch him. In the nursery, laughter turning into silence as his small frame collapsed against the floor. Each episode left him exhausted, his lips pale, his eyes distant, as though he had been momentarily pulled into another world. Among his siblings, the differences widened. Edward, the heir, stood tall, rehearsing the posture of a king in waiting. Mary, his sister, practiced her piano pieces with discipline. George donned a sailor's uniform and prepared for service. John, meanwhile, struggled even to follow a simple lesson. His governess tried to guide his hand across a page, but letters scattered like broken shapes. He preferred chasing birds in the garden to sitting still at a desk. The family began to withdraw him quietly from public view. His name appeared less in announcements. His image was absent from official photographs. At ceremonies where the royal children once lined up in order, John was no longer present. The silence around him was deliberate, carefully measured. Every portrait that omitted him, every speech that failed to mention him, was part of a slow vanishing. Even within the palace, courtiers whispered, "The prince is not fit." Some said. The words stung because they were not spoken with cruelty, but with resignation. A dynasty built on symbols of strength and stability could not allow weakness to stand in full view. Still, those who cared for John saw something different. His nurse, Charlotte Bill, known as Lala, noticed the brightness in his laughter, the way he lit up at the sight of animals, the stubborn joy that pulsed through him even as his body betrayed him. She later recalled, "He was happiest chasing butterflies, not crowns." It was a simple truth, but it revealed the gulf between who he was and what the world expected him to be. Queen Mary kept her composure. Though her letters hinted at the strain, she described John as a great anxiety. To her, the difference was not only maternal worry, but a reminder of how little control she had over destiny. A prince was supposed to represent order, yet John embodied disorder. One evening, during a family gathering, John suddenly fell into a violent seizure. The room froze. His brothers and sisters stood still, their eyes wide, as servants rushed forward. When it ended, he lay weak and pale in Lala's arms. Queen Mary turned away, her voice low but sharp. He must be kept safe and quiet. It was not a sentence of rejection, but it carried the weight of inevitability. John would not grow into the image of a prince the monarchy required. The seed of tragedy had taken root. A child born to royalty, yet refused by the destiny that had seemed certain at his birth. From that point on, his path diverged. While his siblings stepped further into the spotlight, John's steps carried him away from it. He was being moved toward a life in the shadows, where the empire would not see him, where silence would become his only crown. By the time John was 6, the pattern had already begun. His siblings were dressed in uniforms, in silks and metals, their hands trained to wave, their voices trained to repeat words of duty. John was dressed simply and kept away. Each time the royal family lined up for photographs, a quiet hand would guide him out of the frame. His absence was never explained, but he felt it. Even a child could feel when the world turned its face away. At Sandringham, John lived in Wood Farm, a red brick house that was both shelter and cage. The days followed a rhythm unlike the lives of his brothers and sisters. They had tutors, ceremonies, and visits to London. He had gardens, dogs, and silence. He could run until his lungs burned, laughing at the sound of geese flapping into the air. But beyond the hedges, the world seemed to vanish. His playground was a kingdom with no crown. Visitors described him as affectionate, lively, sometimes uncontrollable. He loved climbing trees, rolling in the grass, splashing in puddles after the rain. In those moments, he seemed freer than any of his siblings bound by royal ritual. Yet freedom carried its own boundaries. His seizures could come without warning. One instant he was chasing a ball across the lawn. The next his body stiffened and he collapsed into the earth. Servants rushed forward, lifting him gently, carrying him inside. When he woke, he would ask no questions. He simply wanted to return outdoors. There was resilience in him, a stubborn joy that refused to vanish. But around him, the silence grew heavier. His brothers and sisters visited less often. They belonged to the world of uniforms and ceremonies, a world where their youngest brother had no place. John noticed their absence, though he rarely spoke of it. Sometimes, when he spotted a carriage arriving in the distance, His face would light up with hope, only to fall again when it passed without stopping. One observer recalled a single haunting line. After watching his siblings ride away, John asked softly, "Why do they never stay?" The words revealed more than he understood. He was not exiled to some far-off land, but he was exiled nonetheless. Exiled from duty, from recognition, from the story his birth had promised. His life unfolded in plain sight, within the walls of Sandringham. Yet the empire he belonged to pretended he was not there. In photographs from this period, the contrast is striking. His siblings appear beside their parents, rigid in posture, prepared for the future. John's face is missing, as if he had already been cut from the script. But in the gardens, he still smiled, his hair wild in the wind, his cheeks flushed with play. A prince in name, a child in truth, living in a world narrowed to trees, fields, and the eyes of the nurse who guarded him. The silence that defined his exile was not only the absence of his image, it was the absence of belonging. He was still alive within the walls of Sandringham, still laughing in the fields. But history had already begun to erase him. At Wood Farm, John's world was small but vivid. He woke with the first light, tugged the curtains aside, and let the morning flood his room. Bare feet met the cool floorboards. Before anyone called his name, he was already outside, breathing the damp air that rose from the fields. The garden became his map of wonders. He traced the lines of ants with a fingertip, watched a ladybird travel the curve of a leaf, and chased after butterflies that always skimmed just beyond his reach. A ball bounced ahead of him. The dogs answered with bursts of joy, and together they crossed the grass like a rolling wave. Here, there were no titles to remember, no ceremonies to hold. There was only motion, laughter, and sky. Indoors. The rhythm changed but did not fade. He stacked wooden blocks into careful towers, paused to admire them, then laughed when they fell. He opened books and turned the pages for the sound alone. The soft rasp of paper soothed him more than words ever could. On winter evenings, he pressed his cheek to the window and watched frost creep across the pane. A silver forest growing in silence while the house grew warm behind him. The storms came without warning. A toy slipped from his hand. A tremor seized his small frame. The room spun out of reach. When it passed, a stillness followed that felt larger than the room itself. His eyelids fluttered. Color returned slowly to his face. He drew a breath, tested his feet, and looked toward the door that opened to the garden. The plea was simple and always the same. "May I go outside?" It was not defiance, it was a vow to keep joy alive. He learned the textures of quiet, the tick of a distant clock, the thud of a book closing in another room, the muffled echo of hooves on a road he could not see. He did not know that his name rarely appeared in papers. He did not weigh his worth against portraits that never included his face. The garden answered every question that letters and speeches could not. Sun on his skin meant enough. The soft weight of a dog's head against his knee meant enough. There was a light in him that did not argue with fate. It simply kept burning. He did not plan futures or draft duties. He collected moments, the color of a robin's breast, the taste of rain on his lips, the way wind bent the long grass and then let it rise again. A child's measure of time, counted in small wonders. This life was narrow, but it was not empty. It held the sweetness of ordinary things, and he met them with an open gaze that made them feel rare. The world beyond Wood Farm hardly noticed him. Yet within these fields he left a trail of laughter that morning air could carry for a long way. His days in shadow did not darken him. They taught him how to love what remained, and that is why the winter to come would feel so cold. The winter of 1919 fell heavy across Norfolk. Snow clung to the branches around Sandringham, and the fields were hushed beneath a pale sky. Inside Wood Farm, the air was still colder. Prince John had grown into a boy of 13, tall for his age but fragile, his energy flickering between bursts of joy and sudden exhaustion. His seizures had become more severe, each one stealing more from him than the last. On the evening of January 18th, the house seemed unusually quiet. The war had ended only months before, and the royal family was consumed by ceremonies and duties in London. At Wood Farm, John settled into bed as he always did, the blankets pulled to his chin, his toys lined neatly on the table beside him. His nurse checked the fire, adjusted his pillow, and whispered a good night. The wind rattled against the window panes. Beyond the glass, the world was frozen in silence. The fit came in the small hours, sudden and merciless. His body convulsed, his chest heaving as if it were caught in a storm. The nurse rushed to him, lifting his head, trying to soothe the spasms that shook him. She called his name, but his eyes had rolled back, fixed on a place no one else could see. The struggle lasted only minutes, yet it seemed endless. Then, with one last shudder, his small body went still. "The boy is gone." The words were spoken softly, as if the walls themselves might recoil. They carried through the house like a bell struck in the night. For those who stood there, the moment seemed unreal. The prince who had filled the garden with laughter, who had clapped at the sound of falling spoons, who had begged to return outside after each storm of his illness, now lay silent in his narrow bed. His parents were not there. King George and Queen Mary remained in residence elsewhere, informed only after the fact. It was the nurse who bore witness, the only hand to touch him in his final moments. A boy born to a crown, yet leaving the world with no royal vigil, no grand chamber, only the quiet presence of one who had cared for him. The bed was small, the sheets embroidered with the royal crest, yet the scene could have been any child's death. No fanfare, no procession, just a still face and the weight of a silence that seemed too large for the room. Outside, frost continued to spread across the fields, untouched by grief. When the announcement reached the public, many reacted with surprise. Some had never known the boy existed. The newspapers printed his name with solemnity. Photographs appeared that had rarely been seen, and Britain realized for the first time that a son of the king had lived among them, hidden in plain sight. His short life, erased from portraits and ceremonies, now emerged only at its end. In the days that followed, the family spoke of their sorrow, yet the words felt thin against the years of absence. He was remembered by those who had known him best as gentle, mischievous, unpredictable, full of sudden laughter. But history quickly turned its gaze elsewhere, leaving John to fade once more into the shadows. He died at 13, in a room warmed by firelight, in a bed marked by the crest of kings, but with no crown upon his head. His end was not that of a prince, but of a child whose life had been hidden until even death could not keep the silence intact. History remembers Prince John not as a statesman or a soldier, but as a shadow on the royal tree. His name appears in genealogies, printed small, often overlooked among the shining titles of his brothers and sisters. His face is absent from the great portraits that line the halls of Windsor. What remains is a faint outline, a whisper of a boy who lived and died almost unseen. He became, in death, what he had been in life, a question. How could a Prince of England vanish so quietly from the narrative of empire? His short years left no policies, no alliances, no heirs. Yet they left a wound that reveals more about monarchy than triumph ever could. A dynasty that prided itself on continuity chose silence over presence, absence over acknowledgement. At Sandringham, the small house of Wood Farm still stands. Visitors pass its walls without realizing that a life once unfolded there in hidden intensity. Within those walls, John laughed, stumbled, played with dogs, watched frost on windows, and endured storms of illness that shook his fragile body. He lived fully in his small world, even as the greater world pretended he did not exist. His story is not only about illness or exile, it is about erasure. Every missing photograph, every ceremony where he was absent, every newspaper that failed to mention his name together, they reveal the lengths to which power will go to protect its image. A crown built on duty could not admit weakness, even when that weakness was a child of its own blood. And so John became a symbol, not of royalty, but of silence. A reminder that even in palaces, innocence can be hidden, voices can be muted, and lives can be folded out of sight. The tragedy is not only that he died young, but that he was never truly allowed to live in the eyes of his people. If a prince could be erased by his own family, how many others, born without crowns, were buried not in earth but in silence? His story forces us to look again at the pages of history and ask whose names are missing, whose lives were deliberately forgotten. Prince John's life ended at 13, but his absence continues to echo. It lingers in the empty space of family portraits, in the quiet corridors of Sandringham, in the unanswered question of why a boy who smiled so brightly was hidden from the world. This is not just the story of a lost prince. It is a mirror held up to power, showing how easily truth can be silenced. If you have followed his journey with us, let his memory stay alive in your thoughts. And if you wish to uncover more hidden fates, more stories the crown tried to bury, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, so together we can continue to bring into the light the shadows history tried to forget.